Hello, everybody, and welcome to the From Poverty to Progress channel, the channel that is devoted to promoting an awareness and understanding of human progress. My name is Michael Magoon, and I am the author of the From Poverty to Progress book series. The first book in my book series is entitled From Poverty to Progress, and it explains the origin and causes of modern progress. My second book, which I'm excited to announce is now available on pre-release, is about applying those lessons, so how we can keep progress going, both in the United States, Western Europe, and in developing nations. Today I'm going to start a multi-part series entitled, What is Wrong with American Politics? Now, I think that's probably a topic a lot of you have been thinking about. And as a former professor in political politics, I think I have a unique perspective on what's going on today. If you want to know more about this topic, you should read my new book, Promoting Progress. To purchase, see links in the description. But first of all, I want to explain, what does this have to do with progress? After all, that's the topic of this channel, right? Well, I believe that in order to promote progress, we need to implement a progress-based reform agenda, which I discuss in my new book, Promoting Progress. It consists of 4 points. 1, to promote long-term economic growth, which is really the core of what progress is. But it also needs to be widely shared. So we need to create a prosperous working class, and we need to promote a clear pathway that enables youth from low-income families to enter that prosperous working class. And above all, we need to focus on results. We can't just focus on what's popular. We can't just focus on good intentions. We need to show results. But the question comes, can we implement this reform agenda with our current political situation? And unfortunately, the answer is clearly no. Right now, pretty much all political power is divided between 2 political parties, neither of which is the slightest bit interested in promoting progress. The Democratic Party is controlled by left liberal activists that are hostile to progress, or they completely misunderstand what progress is and how to achieve it. The Republican Party is controlled by conservative activists that are skeptical of progress and believe that progress is tearing down everything that they believe in. Both are far more concerned about defeating their partisan opponents than they are in advancing the necessary reforms to promote progress. So let's get back to the topic. What is wrong with American politics? Well, first of all, how do we know there's something wrong with American politics? Well, I think there are a lot of good symptoms, some of which I'll get into more detail later in this video. But first of all, we have increasing polarization in the parties. They're each moving further and further from the center, where most American voters are. There has been an increasing loss of trust in government, particularly the federal government. Our support for elected leaders is about as low as it's ever been in polls. We've seen riots and civil disturbances, and we seem to go from one scandal to the next scandal. So clearly, there's something going wrong. But perhaps, maybe it's always been that way. I'm really interested in history, so the first thing that I do when I hear someone talk about how bad things are is to compare it to how things actually were in the past. So has American politics always been like this? Well, no, I don't think so. If you look at the leadership that America's had in the past, particularly during the founding era, it was really quite extraordinary. I would stack up the leadership that the United States had during the beginning of the Republic with any other nation that's ever existed, with George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. That's just to list a few. So clearly, it hasn't been the case that we've had bad leadership for all of American history. Well, maybe things went downhill after the founding. Well, I don't think so either. A lot of American presidents and political leaders were at best average, but we still had an awful lot of very impressive politicians in the 19th century. For example, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln, and a little bit later, Theodore Roosevelt. Those again would stack up with leaders in just about any country in the world. Well, maybe it was the 20th century. I don't think that's true either. I mean, we've had Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan. I think all of those presidents, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, they qualify as showing important leadership for the country, and they had significant amount of public support from the people. So now, I don't want to offend anybody, and I'm sure I will with this statement, but I am very confident that the leadership that we've had over the last 25 years has been dramatically less than what we have in the past. I know some of the watchers like some of the people that I have listed here, but personally, I believe all of them are at best average, and realistically, I think they're much lower than that. But it's not just about leadership. There are many other trends which show there's a clear problem in American politics. For example, there has been a clear trend based on polling data of declining trust in the American government. And now we only have polling data going back roughly to 1960, so it's possible that there was a lot less trust in the past, but I don't think so. I think it's quite likely that American trust in government today is lower than it's ever been in our history. And it also shows up in declining support for the two major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. Based on polling data, in the past, the majority of the people identified clearly with either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And people tended to have a positive view of the other party. I know that's hard to believe in this day and age, but it's true. Now, independents are far larger than either the identifiers of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And many people now are motivated more by voting against the Republicans or against the Democrats. Not so much a positive affinity to one of the party, but a very strong opposition to one of the party. That's something that we haven't seen before. At the same time, when you ask people, is America going in the right direction or are they in the wrong track? You can see over the last 15 years, very clear majority of people believing America is going in the wrong direction. So if you think there's something the matter with American politics, you're not alone. At the same time, we've recently had lots of riots and civil disturbances. Now, these are clearly not unique in American history, but I do think there are additional symptoms that something is wrong. And yet at the same time, incumbents are getting reelected at the highest levels ever. Now, to me, this is really a smoking gun of something that is fundamentally the matter. People are very upset at the direction politics is going, but yet they're continually re-electing their own representatives. And if you look on the state and local level, the re-election rates are even higher. Now, there are many different theories onto why this is, and I'm going to go into a lot of those over the next few episodes, starting in this one. But I want to start out with one that I think is particularly compelling. This is a book entitled The Politics Industry: How Political Innovation Can Break Partisan Gridlock and Save Our Democracy. It's written by a political scientist named Catherine Gale and a business strategist named Michael Porter. Now, you may not have heard of Michael Porter, but he is one of the most influential business strategists in the world. And he has a theory that he calls the competitive forces framework. Businesses all around the world come to him to try and analyze their business sector so they can determine what the best strategy is for their corporation. And he uses his theory to give them customized advice. Porter has long argued that business sectors can best be understood by analyzing the terms of competition of the following 5 forces. The rivals, in other words, the various corporations who are competing against each other for a specific market. The buyers. I know we think of most customers as individual people, but for many industries, the buyers are corporations themselves. And the characteristics of those buyers can have a big impact on the companies themselves. At the same time, there are suppliers. Very few companies build 100% of their product themselves. Most of them contract out to suppliers, and those suppliers have a certain amount of influence over business strategy. And finally, every corporation has to be concerned about new corporations coming in as to compete against them, and technological innovation that creates substitutes that tend to undermine the entire industry. So in order to understand a typical business sector, you need to think about all of those factors. Now, this theory has been very widely applied in the business world and in the economics world, but up until now, no one has applied it to politics. Well, Catherine Gell is a political scientist, and she had the idea that Porter's competitive forces framework can also be applied to the American political system. Just like corporations, political parties need to compete, and when there are the right terms of competition, you get a win-win scenario where the companies get profits and the customers get what they want. But when you have something tended towards monopoly, you get the opposite. The competition or lack of competition ends up benefiting the people in the company or in the party, and the customers are the ultimate losers. So she believes, and I agree with her, that the American political system is what they call a duopoly. A duopoly is essentially, it's like a monopoly where there's very limited competition, but there's two partners in that monopoly, and they work together to keep out all outsiders. Now, we think of the Democrats and the Republicans as fighting in a life or death struggle against each other, but they also have a lot of interests in common of keeping rival political organizations out of our political system. They, in fact, function very much like a private monopoly. Now, this is a very interesting way of looking at the American political system. We take for granted that the Democrats and the Republicans have dominated American politics, and there isn't any real reasonable alternative. Now, many countries have what you can call a two-party system, but the United States is unusual in many characteristics. First of all, the Democratic Party is probably the oldest mass party in the world. You might even call it the oldest political party, period. It was founded, depending on your interpretations, probably in the 1830s by Martin Van Buren, who was a follower of Andrew Jackson. Some people say the Democratic Party goes back even further. The Republican Party is likely the second oldest mass party, and it was founded in the 1850s. To the best of my knowledge, there are no other important institutions in American society, or perhaps even any society, that have had a 50% market share for near this long. That is 50% each. Now, if you look virtually everywhere in American society, we take for granted competition with many different options. And we think of a lot of powerful corporations, for example, or religions or nonprofits as having lasted for a long period of time. But in many cases, they only last a few decades. Typically, in most industries, you have 3 to 5 dominant corporations. Some of them are American, some are foreign, and their peak only lasts a few decades. So a few examples of near monopolies that have lasted a few decades were the railroad companies of the 19th century, Standard Oil around the turn of the century, U.S. Steel, and more recently, tech companies. Now, we take for granted that Microsoft and Apple and Facebook have a dominant role, but it's been relatively short term. All of these companies were founded less than 50 years ago, and very few of them have been truly dominant for more than a couple of decades. So what the Democrats and the Republicans have done is truly extraordinary. Catherine Gell believes that they are fundamentally the foundation of what she calls the political industrial complex, obviously playing on the term military industrial complex. Now, the political industrial complex applies Michael Porter's theories and looks at the rivals, which in this case are the Democrats and the Republicans. Again, there's only two of them. Nobody else really has that much of a realistic chance. The customers, who are voters and primary voters, campaign finance donators, and channels, which these are the ways the political parties communicate to customers, which is via the media, social media, and campaign advertising. There are also suppliers, who are potential candidates, campaign consultants, data shops selling things, for example, of voting history of people and demographic characteristics of people, so that way the campaigns know who exactly to target and where. And also think tanks who develop policies. Then she also looks at substitutes, which would be, for example, independents, or new entrants into the political system, which would be new parties. And what you clearly see is that you have two dominant parties that have essentially 100% of the market share, and all of these other players in the system are forced to choose sides. And the reason is very simple, because the competition has been stifled. Unlike a typical sector of the American economy, substitutes, i.e. independents and third parties, which would be new entrants in the field, are stifled. There's a whole host of rules, for example, ballot access restriction laws, limited fundraising ability, limited media coverage, third parties and independents not being allowed into debates, and voters being worried about wasting their vote. And there are also many other institutional factors as well, which I will discuss later. Now, what you may not know is many of these rules are created by quote-unquote bipartisan agencies. For example, the Federal Election Commission. And to make sure that neither the Democrats or the Republicans control it, they are essentially given about 50% of the seats. How much are independents given? How much are third parties? Well, zero. So in other words, even though the Democrats and the Republicans are rivals in Congress and among elected offices, in terms of setting the rules, they cooperate together. In other words, they're like two corporations who have a monopoly, who set the government regulations for their own benefit. So what this means is that effectively all the customers, channels, and suppliers are forced to choose one of the rivals to support. If someone fails to do so, it means that they will not be able to work, and so effectively they'll have to find another career choice. Now, it didn't used to be like this. There used to be many different institutions and individuals who were in politics, who were nonpartisan. Now, they had specific viewpoints, but it wasn't about choosing sides between the Democrats and the Republicans. Our political industrial complex has effectively forced everyone to choose sides. And when you do that, then you have to bend your beliefs to your financial incentives. So what this does is it creates two groups with little ideological diversity. You have conservative activists who dominate the Republican Party and all the customers, channels, and suppliers that work with the Republican Party. And you have left liberal activists who control the Democratic Party and all customers, channels, and suppliers. Diversity of opinion quickly goes out the window in such a system. Now, Catherine Gale makes a really good point. From the perspective of the American people, the system is broken. People clearly don't like the way things are going, and they don't have any realistic options. But from the perspective of the people within the political industrial complex, it's functioning extremely well. With each election cycle, the complex generates $100 billion in revenue. And even more to the point, the winner of that election cycle gets control over trillions of dollars of government revenue, which then they can redirect to their supporters as a reward for supporting them. So now, I don't mean to say that the people involved in politics don't believe in anything that they're saying. Many of them do. But you also have to look at it from the perspective of an industry. I think this causes a significant amount of problems. First of all, it tends to undermine the problem-solving ability of our political system. Both Democrats and Republicans and almost all the other political organizations focus on rallying the base against the other side instead of trying to solve problems. And in fact, they don't have an incentive to cause the problems. They want to use the problems as a way of rallying their base so they can win the next election cycle. I'm sure you've seen it, particularly in media coverage, that every single event that happens immediately gets spun by both sides as a way of trying to advance their own political agenda. They're not actually trying to solve the problem. They're trying to use the problem for their own political gain. Now, to a certain extent, that's what politics is always going to be about. But the incentives within the system make it much worse. Another problem that is not mentioned as much in the book is that our politics is getting increasingly centralized. The federal government has grown dramatically over the last century, and so that undercuts a lot of the state and local variation that could enable differing point of views to get represented in the government. So not only do we have only two alternatives effectively control the federal government, which is the single greatest power base in the United States. So what you effectively get is what I would call trench warfare in Washington, D.C. between the Democrats and the Republicans trying to struggle over the revenue brought in by the political industrial complex. And due to many different factors, which I will go into in other episodes, what you effectively have in any one region is a one party in control. Now, typically in any one metro area or county, you have one party that is far ahead of the other in terms of public support, and they're almost guaranteed to win the election, particularly on the local and state and House level. Now, when you get up to gubernatorial, Senate, president, then you start to get more competition. But the lower levels tend to have less competition because one party is effectively in control. For example, an organization called Fair Vote, which does some pretty good work, classifies the 435 House districts based on their level of competition. Now, only 86 of them are what they consider competitive. In other words, the Democrats and the Republicans are within about 10% of each other. And so it's possible that one of the parties could win in any given election. So what this means is about 80% of the House general elections are non-competitive. We know 2 years from now, 4 years from now, and maybe even 10 years from now, which party is going to win in any specific elections. About 40% of them are controlled by the Democrats, and about 40% are controlled by the Republicans. So effectively, in the most important elections, there's very little competition at all. Now, again, on the Senate level, there tends to be more competition. The gubernatorial level, there's more competition, and on the presidential level. But when you're at the House, state, or local level, you have very low levels of competition, with one party being effectively a guaranteed winner in the general election. So why is this a problem? Well, in my first book, From Poverty to Progress, I try and explain what the fundamental preconditions are for progress. And I argue for a concept called the 5 keys to progress. And I'm not going to go into any details on what those are. You can see them in my video, What Causes Progress. But the one that's most important for this topic is the 3rd key to progress, which is that decentralized political, economic, religious, and ideological power. Of particular importance are elites being forced into transparent, nonviolent competition that undermines their ability to forcibly extract wealth from the masses. This allows citizens to freely choose among institutions based upon what they have to offer to each individual and society in general. So this transparent, nonviolent competition, elites don't want that. Elites love monopolies. Elites love to be able to use violence to force their agenda onto the rest of society. But if we have a set of institutions and values that force transparent, nonviolent competition, then we have better outcomes for the masses. And that's unfortunately increasingly being eroded in American politics. And it all comes down to negative incentives created by the political industrial complex. And unfortunately, those negative incentives are spreading beyond the political parties. What we want from our institutions are to be competing against each other to offer the most benefits to individuals and the most benefits to society. And we don't want them to be involved in the political struggle. Let them focus on what they're supposed to do. Instead, our institutions, and not just political institutions, are increasingly choosing sides in the partisan politics, and they're focusing on telling the base of that party what they want to hear. And essentially it comes down to a simple message. We are moral and the other side is immoral. My guess is all of you have clearly seen this in the media. It used to be the American media was relatively neutral and nonpartisan. You effectively had three major networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, and they tried to be relatively neutral and nonpartisan. Yes, they had a political slant, but it was nothing like what we had today. And we typically had in each metro area one or two newspapers who tried really hard not to be ideological except on their editorial pages. But now we have a very different situation where Fox, CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, Washington Post, they're all making deliberate decisions that they want to market to one specific side of the partisan conflict. So they have effectively established a business model of attacking the other side and spinning every event into a reason why our side are the good guys and the other side is the bad guys. Now, there are a lot of other factors going on to it. The technological impact of, for example, cable television news, which enabled far more networks to be established, and the internet created a fragmentation of the media market. And we've also clearly seen this among social media companies. I'm not going to get too much into detail for this because I don't want to get censored myself, but I think you know what's going on. The same thing is happening to interest groups. Back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, most interest groups tended to be nonpartisan, but now they're increasingly choosing sides in the partisan conflict. The same thing is happening with think tanks that develop new policy ideas. In the past, a significant chunk of them were not affiliated with either one of the parties, but that's becoming increasingly rare. And the same with political campaigns. It used to be that fundraisers, companies that had voter databases and campaign consultants, would tend to be nonpartisan. They would work with either the Democrats or the Republicans. Now, that's extremely difficult to do. So now, why are these organizations making that choice? Because that's where the money is. They're making a conscious business decision to choose one of the sides in order to make money. And the problem is, as you do that, you're increasing the polarization throughout society. Now, I'm not saying that they don't believe what they say, but I am saying that they have incentives to conveniently ignore issues that tend to conflict with their side. And so you get far less ideological diversity within those two organizations. And it's important to understand this is a business model. And what's worse is they are deliberately triggering our worst psychological instincts for their own benefit by focusing on the negative, and particularly why the other side is so terrible and how bad things are. Politicians get votes. Activists get media coverage. The media gets viewership. Interest groups get fundraising. Social media gets likes and engagement. Institutions increasingly find that the best way to make money is to get involved in the partisan conflict, choose a side, and try and mobilize one side as your customer base. And with increasing sophistication of algorithms and marketing research, this makes the model even more effective. By focusing so much on the negative, what they're actually doing is they're breeding worry, anger, resentment, and resignation. And now, most recently, corporations are getting into the act. Up until quite recently, no corporations wanted to get involved in controversial political issue because they didn't want to piss off 50% of their customers. But now, increasingly, corporations, my guess through their own marketing research and their own algorithms, are realizing that if they take a stand on controversial issues, it's good public relations for the company. And if you believe that the corporations actually are fighting for justice or to make America great, well, no, they're doing it for public relations. And it's not just that it's dishonest and deceptive. It's also that this distorts the organizational goals. Every institution in society was founded for a specific purpose, to help solve a specific problem and to allow people to choose that solution if it works for them. Now, and to be good at doing something, you need to focus on one goal. Once you start adding in new goals, for example, that you're going to a commitment to social justice or to make America great again, then you start undermining your original goal. And they need to understand that they're undermining their own legitimacy. All institutions in American society, based on polls, are seeing declining public trust. And I think a lot of these companies are trying to jump on a political bandwagon, thinking that that will rescue them from the declining trust, when in fact, it gets worse because you end up pissing off half or more of the American electorate. It's important that we understand that these organizations are manipulating us. Now, I have a lot of videos about ideology and where it comes from. But I believe that ideologies are one of the fundamental dangers undermining progress. They trigger the non-rational side of the human brain and help to make us feel moral and project an image that one is moral, but they create an us versus them mentality that undermines our problem-solving ability. And they shift the focus from results to displaying good intentions. And ultimately, they lead to failure because they do not embrace reality. Our beliefs should bring us together. There's a lot of evidence that groups with a common ideology cooperate better. Up until about 1970 or so, our political leaders, on both the Democrats and the Republicans, shared many beliefs of patriotism, of Christianity, and a belief in progress. Now, regardless of whether you think these viewpoints are good or bad, they were unifying. And let's face it, America worked pretty darn well during that time period. But unfortunately, ideologies can do exactly the opposite. And that's what's happening now. These business models are promoting ideologies that divide us by so many characteristics, such as race, gender, religion, region, age, gender identity, and the list just keeps on growing. So whether you agree with the ideologies or not, it's very clear that they are creating divisions that did not exist in the past, or at the very least are intensifying those divisions far beyond how much they ever existed. Groups with a common ideology tend to cooperate better, but it's also the content of those beliefs that matter. Groups whose ideologies are more closely aligned with reality and bring people together tend to beat out groups whose ideologies are not closely aligned with reality. I believe there is an alternative, and that's what I'm sketching out in my new book, Promoting Progress. This is the first part in a multi-part series on the topic of what is wrong with American politics and listing out specific reforms that I believe can help make the American political process better for all Americans and make it possible to implement a progress-based reform agenda. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please don't forget to subscribe and like. It really helps the channel to grow. If you'd like more resources, I'd recommend going to my website, FromPovertyToProgress.com. With a free email subscription, you get free ebook samples, free audio samples, and you can buy discounted ebooks and audiobooks. If you insist on paying full price, you can get ebooks, paperbacks, and hardcovers at Amazon, or if you're a bookstore or a library, you can get them at IngramSpark. Audiobooks are available at Amazon, Audible, and iTunes. If you'd like to know more about books related to this content, I'd recommend going to my other website, which is the techratchet.com. It consists of an online library of over 280 book summaries on the topics of technology, history, economic growth, and progress. And now we're getting on to the exciting part, a free book giveaway of my first book, From Poverty to Progress. If you're a regular listener, you already know the rules. If you don't know the rules, please pause this video and read this description. There's a free book giveaway every week. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next time.